Hello everybody. In this video we're going to take a look at how to create a tileable brick texture, or at least one way to create a tileable brick texture. So what I've done first is walked around in my neighborhood and I found this brick wall and I took a picture of it. And a couple things to take note of when I took a picture of it. I avoided having any strong shadows in it. This particular example, it was sunny outside, but I took a picture of this in the shade. You could also take pictures on an overcast day and you might get better results that way. If you get something where the sun is directly on it and there are shadows being cast, that can be problematic, of course. And the second bit of advice is to try to take the photograph as much straight on as you can so that you don't get much of a sense of perspective in your image. This will make it much easier to line everything up. So the first thing I'm going to do is adjust the levels of this photograph here. So I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, Levels, and I'll just play around with these values a little bit just to get maybe a little bit of a stronger image here, so maybe it looks a little less washed out. I think that looks good, so I'll go ahead and say OK. Now when I took the photograph, I tried to make sure that everything was as straight as possible. But to further make sure of that, what I'm going to do is double click on my background layer here. This will make this into a regular layer rather than a background layer. And then I'm going to come over here to Image, Analysis, and I'm going to select the Ruler tool. You'll notice that this Ruler tool can also be accessed here in your tools. Now that I have the Ruler tool selected, I'm going to draw a horizontal line along one of these lines of bricks. I'll pick this one right here, these 4 bricks here, and right at the base in this lower left corner, I'm going to click and drag over to the 4th brick here to the bottom right corner. And then I'm going to click over here on Straighten Layer. And you saw that it shifted ever so slightly, but what this does is ensures that this is horizontal, at least along the base of these 4 bricks here. You'll notice if you really look at the image, it's rotated this layer. We have these little areas here and here where we don't have image because this layer has actually been subtly rotated. Now, sometimes if you've taken the photograph at more of a perspective, where there's an obvious perspective in the photograph, you may need to do something like this. I'm going to go ahead and create another layer just so I can show you. You can kind of straighten things up if you need to by going to Edit, Transform, Distort. And if you need to kind of straighten things up a little bit more because you've got a sense of perspective, you can simply straighten things up this way. Now, I don't really need to because I've done a pretty good job taking this photograph straight on, but that's how you could manually straighten things up if you needed to so that things will align appropriately. I'm going to get rid of that layer and we'll continue. So the next thing I need to do is determine the pattern of the bricks and what I want to be repeating. I'm making this into a tileable texture, a seamless tileable texture, so we have to determine what our pattern of this texture is going to be. The other thing is we're going to want our texture to be perfectly square. And then eventually we'll make it of dimensions of either 1024 or 2048 by 2048. Okay. So I'm going to select my crop tool and we'll see how we might be able to crop this to get a pattern that we can repeat. Now, if I look at these 2 bricks here and then 3 bricks underneath, we could create a repeating pattern that looks something like, oops, I've got the wrong tool selected here. Let me select my crop tool. Okay. We could create a pattern that would be something like this, for example, because you'll see that we'd have our 2 bricks and then 2 bricks, where this brick will continue on here like that, and this could repeat over and over again once we make it seamless. The only problem is this is not very square, and I think we would prefer to create a square texture. So I'm still going to use these 2 bricks here, but perhaps try a couple different patterns. This will not repeat. This could potentially repeat. Because again, we're starting with the 2 and then the 2 with the 1 being cut off, if that makes sense. I could also come down here like this, and we could probably make this into our repeating pattern. And this is pretty square, so I think that would be maybe a good candidate. Let me just make a few adjustments to this. And perhaps we can try something like that. I'm going to go ahead and crop this by pressing Enter. And we'll continue from there. Now we're going to want this image to be perfectly square, and it looks like it's mostly square, but maybe not perfect. We'll find out. And we're also going to want it to either be 1024 by 1024 or 2048 by 2048. So I'm going to go up here to Image, Image Size, and we'll take a look at its dimensions. Currently it's at 1976 pixels by 1956 pixels, so almost perfectly square. We're going to make it perfectly square, and we're going to make it the dimensions that we want it to be. You can see there's this button here that will typically be on that ties the dimensions of the width and the height so that it makes sure that it keeps that same ratio that it currently has. If you uncheck that, you can change these 2 dimensions independently of one another, which is what I have just done. I'm going to make the width 1024, and I'm going to make the height 1024. This will compress some of the image. It'll force it to be within the dimensions that I want it to be, so it will alter the image slightly, but that should be okay. So I'll go ahead and click on OK. And now we've got a image that is 1024 by 1024 pixels. Perfect for textures in a 3D package such as Maya. The next thing we'll do is go ahead and offset this image, just as we have done in previous videos. Now remember that this is 1024 by 1024 now, so I'm going to go to Filter, Other, Offset, and as you can see, I've already got it set to offset by 512 and 512 on both the horizontal and the vertical. And I will say OK. Now, because I was very careful when I took the photograph to try to not have any sense of perspective in it, and because we straightened up this layer, it's actually done a reasonably good job right away. However, we do have some seams that we want to get rid of. Let's take a look at those seams. In some places it's more subtle than others, but you'll notice that down the middle, vertically, we've got a seam going all the way down this image. Here it's particularly noticeable, but you can see it in these areas as well. But remarkably, everything is actually lining up pretty well, which is going to make making this into a tilable texture a much easier task. You'll also notice, but this should be very subtle, that we'll have a seam going down the middle horizontally as well. Not as obvious as the vertical seam because it's going through the areas of mortar on the brick wall here, but still a seam nevertheless that we can eliminate, that we can get rid of. So let's go ahead and get started with that. I think I'll first start with this seam going down the middle of our texture vertically, and we'll deal with that. So maybe I'll get started up here at the top. And as in other examples, I will be using the clone stamp. This is very subtle here in the mortar here. Can't really see it all that well, but nevertheless, I'm going to go ahead and clone an area here and just paste it there to get rid of that. We'll paint away this seam, again, by simply selecting an area to clone. You can really play around with the size of your brush. In this case, I do want to use a brush that has softened edges. I don't want really hard edges for this particular example, at least not right now. So I'm going to go ahead and just clone an area maybe on this brick here by holding down Alt and then the left mouse button. And I'll just paint away that seam. Sometimes I like to keep the borders a little bit rough on what I'm painting away. If some of these areas start to look a little obvious, I might clone some other areas in here as well and just kind of dirty it up a little bit. This area is a little bit more problematic only because you can see that the gap between these bricks is probably a little bit more than what I actually want. But that's an easy fix. We'll simply come over here perhaps and clone this corner. Return over here and I'll decide where I want my brick to go, perhaps this far, and we'll simply paint that brick in. A little bit of a seam here. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. Another area that looks maybe a little bit problematic would be this area here where we've got a little bit of this brick edge here and then a gap right there where this brick begins here. That should be a pretty easy fix though. Let's go ahead and zoom in on that and see what we can do. I'm going to just once again use my clone stamp to get rid of that area. While maintaining that edge there from that one brick. And now I just have on the vertical this area here from this brick all the way to this brick down here. I still have a seam there that I'm going to eliminate. I'm not going to be talking through that, but more or less I'm going to deal with it in the same way that I dealt with this area as well as this area, simply by using my clone stamp. Now, while I might need to further refine it a little later, I think I've pretty much eliminated the seam going down vertically down the middle of this. Now I'm going to deal with this seam here that we have on the horizontal down the middle. This one should actually be pretty easy because it's in between the bricks. It's just this kind of mortar area. Again, I'm simply going to be using my clone tool, so my clone stamp tool, so I'm not going to really talk through that. I'm just going to do it. And now that should be pretty good, actually. We can test it by simply offsetting it again and making sure that there aren't any seams. We can do that by just going to Filter, Other, Offset. And once again, offsetting at 512 by 512, so it actually puts it into the original position that we started out as. But as long as we don't see any seams now going down the middle, making sure that we haven't introduced any new seams, then we should be in good shape with this. Let's go ahead and test it out a little further. I'm going to select everything and copy it and go over to this other image. I'll paste it in here and we'll just quickly test it and see if it tiles successfully. So I'm going to duplicate a couple times. And it looks like it works pretty well. Now, before concluding this video, there's one thing I would like to emphasize, and that is that what I've just done here, I did this merely to test my Tilable texture. I would not want to save this as a Tilable texture because there's no reason to have these repeating um, elements in my texture because this is already Tilable. This is something then that we can bring into Maya and use it on our 3D objects, have it repeat endlessly as our Tilable texture. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.